thank you so much for joining us today, both in person here in Washington, D.C., and those of you that are joining us online. This is the second day of the Global Democracy Coalition Forum, which aims to provide a space for inclusive dialogue to collectively prepare inputs to inform the Summit for Democracy that will be held at the end of March, but also to generate collective ideas for a post-summit process. Yesterday, we had one online panelist and a full in-person panelist table, but today it's the other way around. Richard Wike, next to me here from Pew Research Center, is the only panelist with us in person. I hope you won't feel too lonely, but we're well accompanied with many distinguished panelists on the screen joining us online from literally all over the world, both Europe, Africa, and the US. The aim of this session is to hold a joint reflection among partners in the Global Democracy Coalition and experts on the state of democracy globally, on how it has evolved since the first Summit for Democracy. And we hope that these reflections can help to inform the summit discussions with evidence and data on how the global democracy landscape has evolved between the two summits, what existing challenges persist, what new challenges have emerged, where concerning regressions have been observed, but also where we see positive advances that should be recognized. This joint reflection will enable to draw on various sources of data and analysis on the state of democracy, both based on expert views and public opinion data produced by partners in the Global Democracy Coalition and other experts, in order to really paint a holistic picture of the key challenges and opportunities to democracy from both citizen and expert perspectives. And I think that there is real beauty in this GDC reflection in bringing these different perspectives together that don't always are brought together in the same analysis. So on this panel, we will hear from leading organizations such as Pew Research Center, Alliance of Democracies, the Afrobarometer, which all produce public opinion data on democracy. We will also hear from colleagues at International IDEA who produce both quantitative and qualitative data based on expert opinion data on democracy. And we will hear from our discussant, Pippa Norris, professor at Harvard University and vice president of the World Values Survey, which is the largest non-commercial cross-national empirical time series investigation on human beliefs and values that provide really valuable data as well. So this joint reflection exercise serves two main purposes: to inform the Summit for Democracy on the challenges and advances observed in the global democracy landscape, but also to bring together organizations in the Global Democracy Coalition for this collective reflection and show how by sharing our analytical resources that complement each other, we will be able to paint a more holistic picture of the global democracy landscape than our individual efforts alone. So we will start with the reflections from our panelists on what they and their data observe as the main developments. But we will then also open up the floor for discussion and reflections from those that are joining us both in person and online for additional reflections and inputs. And we will document all these discussions and reflections into a summary document, which we will publish after in the coming week before the Summit for Democracy. We hope that this will provide a valuable input to the summit discussions. This is a topic that is dear to my heart. I led the Global State of Democracy report of International IDEA for 3 years before taking on my new role as head of North America for International IDEA. So I'm going to start by giving the floor to my dear colleague, Seema Shah, the current head of the Democracy Assessment Unit at International IDEA. Seema is the lead author of our flagship publication on the state of democracy, which provides on a yearly basis an assessment of the state of democracy in the world. It's based on the Global State of Democracy Indices, which is a quantitative database on democratic quality in 173 countries in the world. It draws on 12 different databases, of which VDEM data is a significant part. Since November last year, IDEA also produces a global democracy tracker, which provides qualitative information on a monthly basis on democratic developments around the world. And And we will, by the end of this year, also cover 173 countries through this tracker. So Seema, we'll start with you. Based on the various data sources that you have at your disposal, we would like to hear from you what you see coming out from the data on the state of democracy and how it has evolved between the first and the second Summit for Democracy. What existing challenges persist? What new challenges you see emerging, where concerning regressions have been observed, but also where positive advances have been noted. And we would like to hear both about global and regional trends, but maybe also which countries in particular you have noted some of these developments in. So we'll start with you, Seema, over to you.
Thank you so much, Annika. Can everybody see the screen? I think so, right? Yes. Okay. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to present the findings from our newest Global State of Democracy report, and time permitting to showcase our brand new tool, which Annika just told you about, called the Democracy Tracker. I'm going to start today with the findings of the report. At International IDEA, we understand democracy to be a broad concept and one that can have many different manifestations depending on a particular country's context. What you see here is our conceptual framework, which breaks down our definition of democracy into 5 main attributes and 16 sub-attributes. In total, we cover 116 indicators of democracy across 173 countries, starting from 1975 and going through the end of 2021. Our new data set will be released in just a couple of months, and that will reflect 2022. First, democracy is in clear decline. Over the last 6 years, we see that the number of countries moving in the direction of authoritarianism is more than double the number moving toward democracy. We count a country as moving toward democracy when it transitions from authoritarianism to hybridity, or from either of those states to democracy. Conversely, we count a country as moving away from democracy when it suffers a breakdown in democracy or transitions from hybridity to authoritarianism. Notable examples include Zambia moving from hybrid state to democracy in our latest data set, Tunisia moving from democracy to hybridity, and Haiti, Russia, and Mali moving from hybridity to authoritarianism. Second, even in existing democracies, there's a worrying drop in quality. This slide shows you the number of eroding democracies over time. A decade ago, that number was 12. Today, it is 52, which is an increase of more than 300%. When we talk about erosion, what we mean is a statistically significant drop in at least one of our measures of democracy. While most eroders were struggling with 1 or even 2 aspects of democracy, there were countries that were eroding across as many as 7 aspects of democracy in the latest data set. A third noteworthy point is that the data shows serious levels of stagnation over time. On the left, you can see that the number of democracies today is the exact same as it was a decade ago, 104. On the right, you can see that starting in around 2000, there hasn't been much change in any of our attributes. Global average scores are decidedly mid-range across all our attributes. And we think that this pattern is worrying because our context has clearly changed over the last two decades. In addition to obvious changes like an increased reliance on the internet and mobile devices for completion of daily tasks, we have public health concerns now that shape our daily decision-making, a renewed threat of nuclear warfare, and a climate disaster. Protests over the last several years have highlighted people's concerns about longstanding unresolved problems related to inequality, discrimination, and racism, to name just a few issues, and trends in democracy do not appear to have kept up. All of this takes place against a backdrop of an increase in support for authoritarian values. In 2009, only 38% of World Values Survey respondents said it was fairly good or very good to have strong leaders who don't have to bother with parliament or elections. In 2021, that percentage had risen to 52%. Still, there are reasons to be hopeful. You can see a spider plot here on your left that shows the Gambia's performance on all our sub-attributes of democracy. Since the Jammeh regime was defeated in 2016, the country has improved on almost every indicator measured by the GSOD indices. You can see growth by the pink line, which represents 2021. These advances reflect the vision of the country's National Development Plan, a new social contract for Gambians that aims to deliver good governance, national reconciliation, improved social cohesion, and a more inclusive economy. In the Dominican Republic, there have also been notable improvements in things like impartial administration, civil society participation, and checks on government over the last 5 years. Democratic performance there can be traced to the government's efforts to ensure accountability for corruption scandals, a new open dialogue mechanism coordinated by the country's Economic and Social Council, through which multi-sector stakeholders, including civil society representatives, can participate in deliberations related to the reform agenda. And then finally, Moldova, which has entered an unprecedented phase of democratic expansion. Since 2017, improvements there have meant that Moldova is now among the top 25% of countries globally in terms of representative government, social rights and equality, gender equality, and media integrity. Against this backdrop, I thought it would be nice to also look at a number of notable developments in the year of action. First is gender equality. Our democracy tracker has picked up a number of interesting developments related to gender equality around the world in 2022. These include the Sierra Leonean's president backing a bill to decriminalize abortion, Colombia legalizing abortion also in 2022, Finland minimizing requirements for women seeking abortions. These 3 countries joined India, whose Supreme Court eliminated this distinction that was previously applied between married and unmarried women trying to seek abortion care. Spain and Switzerland recently passed only yes means yes consent laws and expanded their definitions of rape. At the same time, it's hard not to mention the serious declines in gender equality we have seen in the United States, where in addition to striking down Roe v. Wade, we have seen certain states taking extreme measures to restrict women's access to reproductive health care. We also see declines in Bulgaria, in Russia, in Poland, and in Hungary. Unfortunately, the year of action has also been marked by continuing attacks against democratic institutions, both in democracies and in non-democracies. The graph here shows you the percentage of non-democracies over time, which you can see has risen sharply in the last decade. Examples of attacks against democratic institutions include in Brazil, where Bolsonaro supporters stormed government institutions as an expression of their distrust in the presidential election results, although allegations have not been supported by evidence. In Tunisia, where as recently as last week, the president clamped down on dissent, detaining more critics, calling them terrorists and traitors. This comes after a very controversial constitutional reform process and what some analysts have called a self-coup. In Belarus, the government passed a law allowing it to strip any citizen of their citizenship for undefined crimes relating to causing grave harm to the interests of the state. Other notable examples include a controversial election reform bill in Mexico, which is criticized for stripping power from the electoral management body, restrictions on the judiciary, the independence of the judiciary in Israel, a spate of coups in West Africa, and of course, the war in Ukraine, which showcases the threat democracy poses to authoritarian regimes. Watching to see how democracies continue to navigate this new security situation will be important for the future legitimacy of the democratic model. A third trend we have seen is the increasing frequency with which climate-related events impact various aspects of democracy. I've included here a snapshot of what the Democracy Tracker has picked up, and you can see that we have seen impacts on things like civil rights, such as the freedom of expression and the freedom of association, social group equality, basic welfare, and personal integrity and security. One of the things we're thinking about here at IDEA as we go forward is how to make the links between climate change and democracy more clearly, so that policymakers have a better grasp of the ways in which climate policy may impact the democratic model. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our latest tool, the Democracy Tracker, which provides qualitative monthly updates at the country level for each of the 173 countries that we cover. These updates are event-based and include developments that we believe have the potential to impact the state of democracy and human rights in each country at the time of reporting. The tracker is housed on a new GSOD platform, which puts all of the global state of democracy analysis in one place. You can see here the 4 categories of the products. And the tracker is organized through country profile pages. So this is a sample profile page. It includes an overview of our quantitative scores from our indices over the last decade for the 5 attributes, a basic information box, which has the basic background information like head of state, head of government, electoral system, etc. A human rights treaties box, which shows you the ratification status for each country, for each of the core human rights treaties. We have a beta version of an early warning tool, which assesses a risk over the next 2 years of backsliding and breakdown, although I just want to stress that this is still very much in beta form and is still being tested. Then we provide an overview, kind of an at a glance view of how attributes have performed at the country level each month. This is color coded. So red represents a net decline that month, green represents a net increase that month, and gray represents status quo that month. Then we have a context setting background, about 500 words that provides a socio-political history of the country so that the monthly updates can be well understood. And then this is the actual monthly update. At the bottom of the page, we have another view of the indices, the quantitative scores for the country, which you can customize. The spider plot there, you can use the bar at the top to scroll across the time period that you're interested in, and it will repopulate the spider plot. And then as sort of an overall view, the tracker aims to provide a holistic view of the state of democracy, providing the quantitative scores at the same time as the qualitative scores. And what you can see here in the top left is that a monthly update is tagged. So you can see how the event that we're reporting relates to the attributes and sub-attributes in our conceptual framework. So you get a sense of what parts or what aspects of democracy are impacted by the event. And then the color coding shows you declines, advances, and status quo. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Seema, for these really interesting reflections based on expert opinion data and the information in the democracy tracker. Thanks also for sharing some features of this excellent new tool that you and your team have developed. I think it will be an excellent resource for all of us in the democracy community. Thanks also for highlighting both some concerning regressions in a number of countries over the past year, but also some positive advances. And interesting that you're mentioning both in terms of regressions and advances, issues that may not in all definitions of democracy appear as associated to democracy, which is gender equality and women's reproductive rights. I think it's very important that you highlight those because democracy is not just about elections or civic space or media freedom or judicial independence. It's also about gender equality and the right of women to decide over their own bodies. And this is closely tied to the health of democracy. We know that democracies are much better than autocracies at guaranteeing gender equality. And we also know that gender equality tends to suffer in context of democratic backsliding and autocratization. So thanks for highlighting that. Also the nexus to climate change, I think that will be an important one to explore further going forward. So we are now going to turn to our next speaker, Olaf Böhnke, Senior Advisor at Alliance of Democracies. Welcome, Olaf, online. We will hear what you have to tell us about your public opinion data on the state of democracy. Since 2019, the Alliance of Democracies, who is part of the steering group of the Global Democracy Coalition, publishes the Democracy Perception Index, which is one of the world's largest public opinion studies on democracy, covering more than 50 countries, representative of more than 75% of the world's population. Your latest report came out in May last year and provides a picture of perceptions of democracy in 2022 after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Your report covers 53 countries, if I understand correctly, including mature democracies and also newer and backsliding democracies, as well as some authoritarian regimes such as China, Vietnam, and Russia. So, Olaf, if you can share with us a bit more information on your report, what type of countries it covers, what the starkest findings of your latest survey are when it comes to citizen perceptions of democracy during the past year, and how they may have evolved compared to previous years, according to your data. What are some of the key concerns that you observe, and are there some positive findings, or is the picture mostly dark? And also, if you see some key differences between perceptions of democracy across different countries, regions, and regime types. So over to you, Olaf.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So this Democracy Perception Index is a feature we are publishing each year ahead of our annual flagship event, the Copenhagen Democracy Summit, where we gather since 5 years a unique audience from political decision makers, business leaders, to democracy activists and intellectuals from around the world in Copenhagen. And the Democracy Perception Index was introduced at the first summit with actually following the very simple questions, or what do people worldwide actually think about democracy and how important it is to them. So, and I think you mentioned this, it is important when we look into the numbers to realize and have in mind we're talking about perception. So we should all be aware that these are correspondingly subjective, and they will therefore differ from scientific analysis, as we have just seen in the presentation before. So, but that's, I think, what makes the debate today so exciting, actually, to lay the perceptions over the academic findings. Just a word on the methodology, since you asked. So the Democracy Perception Index is a joint venture by our Alliance of Democracies Foundation and a pollster called Latana or Dahlia Research. It's a Berlin-based polling institution. It's the 5th installment of this world's largest annual study on the perception of democracy. And indeed, at the moment, since the very beginning, we're covering 53 countries around the world, representing more than 75% of the world's population. And the limitation to the 53 was more a technical issue, where our pollster partners actually could gather the information. In order to compare public opinion results between more democratic countries and less democratic countries, we followed the categories from Freedom House. So also to be great actually to be here in one room, to create 2 groups. The free group is those labeled by Freedom House as most democratic countries, labeled as free, and the less free countries are the ones labeled as partially free or not free by Freedom House. I think it's important, since I mentioned that it's personal individual perceptions of individuals here, that in some countries surveyed, the government plays, of course, an active role in shaping public opinion and or has policies in place that restrict freedom of speech around certain topics. So this can have a strong influence on the survey results. And I think you will easily identify this in a minute when we have a look at the map and some of the responses we got. Having said that, to ensure respondents' privacy and high quality response data at the same time, our partner Latana does not collect any personal identifiable information on users. So in contrast to surveys conducted face-to-face or by telephone, the anonymity offered by Latana's methodology also helps to reduce response biases on the interview sites and also response self-censorship. So, but as I said, it's still important to keep the factor in mind that since our survey covers many less free countries. Just quickly on the data collection, so the survey is conducted online through internet-connected devices such as smartphones, tablets, and computers. And Latana follows an open recruitment approach that leverages the reach of over 40,000 third-party apps and mobile websites. And to ensure coverage across different demographic groups and geographical regions, they target a highly diverse set of apps and websites, from news to shopping to sports and games. So as a result, Latana's in its overall work as a global pollster generates up to 21 million answers every month from respondents living in as many as 100 different countries. Now to the topics and the content side. So beyond people's general perception of democracy in the
Olaf,
past 5
I think you need
yes.
to turn your slides, just if I can recommend.
You're right. Sorry.
Thank you.
It was not the most interesting part, so just the bullet points. So beyond the general perception of democracies in the past 5 democracy perception indexes, we included themes and patterns such as threats to democracies, global politics, democracy under COVID, the impact of technology and social media on democracy. And in the latest theme last year, we also featured perceptions on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So, and now I will focus on the findings. And since you requested if I have a good message, yes, I think the news here, the good news is that the global faith in democracy remains very, very high. And that's a result we have seen over the past 5 years here. As a little feature, we also did a little polling and survey with our democracy community on social media yesterday and today, and asked the question, do you agree or disagree with the following statement? In the long term, I believe that democracy as a form of government will prevail globally. And the positive result is our audience is in line also with the global trend that 85% agrees that democracy will prevail as the superior form of governance. But of course, there are not only good and positive findings here. But I think overall, the interesting one here is definitely that people in 2022, by the way, actually had seen, as you can see, a record number of 84% across all the 53 democracies, which believe actually that democracy is important in their countries. So if we look into the map of how that looks here, you can see actually how the world looks like when we ask people how important democracy is for them actually in their countries. The darker the green, the higher the approval of democracy. And but as I mentioned in my disclaimer before, so since in some of the countries we have the impression, of course, that the political censorship or censorship here actually is high. So one of the countries in very deep green actually is China here, for instance. So people have a very positive perception of democracy in China, but the top scorer in general is Greece, with 96% actually of people who still believe in the power of democracy. So this is the good news here, the green. If we look into the perception of people, if they believe actually that the state of democracy in the country they live actually corresponds to their wish for democracy, the map looks very different. So it's only about half of the world that says that their country is actually democratic. And this is even true in democracies labeled as free by Freedom House, where only 59% say that their country is democratic here. And this is the map now from 2022. So this is last year's map. So the message here seems to be quite clear. Governments are not living up to the democratic expectations of their citizens. So while only a little more than half of the people that we polled are satisfied with the state of democracies, 41% feel their countries are not democratic enough, but those people actually are dissatisfied not because they feel they have less democracy, but they want more democracy. So which is again actually a positive message from our poll. But the dissatisfaction is not limited to non-democratic countries, as I said, and it also prevails in countries like the United States, across Europe, and also other countries with a long democratic tradition. When we ask people about the threats to democracies, Oh, no, or maybe let me start differently. So according to Freedom House, sort of the 2021, in 2021 marked the 15th consecutive year that democracy has been in decline globally. So that year we started to look more deeper into the reasons why democracies are under threat, according to people from around the world. And for that poll, we only included countries rated as free and partially free by Freedom House. So countries rated as non-free had been excluded from that part of the survey. And the results show that out of all the threats listed in our DPI, economic inequality is perceived as the most significant threat among the 43 democracies we surveyed. An average of 68% say that economic inequality threatens democracy in their country the most. But due to time constraints, I will not go further into the other factors at this point. However, you can read them all in our report. We then also asked people in our 2020 edition last year what elements or what issues actually concerns them most when it comes to global challenges, and across the 53 countries, this now includes all the countries again, respondents selected war and violent conflict as one of the world's top 3 biggest challenges, more than any other issue, followed by poverty and hunger, and global pandemics. Having in mind that this poll had been conducted in spring last year when the Russian invasion into Ukraine just started, we should not be surprised that the concern of war was the highest in Europe with 48%, way more than in the rest of the world. We also asked at that point, but that's more a footnote, how people perceive the support for Ukraine, the assistance to Ukraine, and 46% at that point, that was in April, May 2022, had the impression that the EU, the US, and NATO are doing too little to help Ukraine. While the vast majority of people around the world supported in general assistance to Ukraine. And nearly half of people actually globally say that the European Union, the United States, and NATO are doing too little to assist, while 43% said that they are doing the right amount, and only 11% at that point said that they are doing too much. We will ask the same, or we are for the new edition of the Democracy Perception Index, we included the same question. So we are very much looking forward to how the numbers will look like this year. At the national level, most people want their governments to focus more on poverty reduction, corruption, and economic growth. And the preferences are surprisingly similar in democratic and non-democratic countries. I maybe leave it here at this point. I think the conclusions from our side, so specifically also looking into that last graph here, is, of course, what we are observing is this ongoing struggle between democracies and autocracies. But still, if you look into the perception of people here, you can see that it is not just the question of an external struggle here, but democracies are also, or democratic governments worldwide are also heavily or there's a heavy demand actually by people actually also to do their homeworks in their own home countries across the world. And I think that's one of the interesting conclusions we took despite all the conversations we see in that global conversation. I leave it at this point, maybe. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Olaf, for these very interesting data points. Thanks also for reminding us of the important work of Freedom House. Katie from Freedom House just came into the room, and Freedom House, as you know, produces Freedom in the World report, which I think celebrates 50 years this year. It's coming out on the 9th of March, and that's the reason why they're not part of this conversation right now, because there is an embargo on the report until then, but we really look forward to reading the report once it comes out in a few days. Freedom House is also an important partner in the Global Democracy Coalition, so I'm glad you're using their data also for for this index. Interesting data that shows a great contrast to what Seema presented. Seema presented expert opinion data on the decline of democracy and the rise of authoritarianism. And despite these negative trends, what you're showing us in terms of citizen perceptions of democracy is that despite, and maybe because of this democratic decline, we're seeing a growing faith in democracy that has been growing, according to your data, every year in the past 4 years. Also very interesting to see the strong faith in democracy even in authoritarian contexts, or very much so in authoritarian contexts such as China. So that is a reason for hope. Also, very interesting in looking at the main drivers of the concerns with regards to democracy, and what is perceived as some of the main threats to democracy, which is economic inequality. So the importance really of looking at some of the drivers behind both the negative and the positive trends that we're seeing, and the importance of linking economic and social issues with democracy, and seeing those linkages. So thank you very much, Olaf, for sharing this data. We're looking forward to the new data set when it comes out in May, in time for your Copenhagen summit. And now we're going to turn to Richard Wike next to me, Director of Global Attitudes Research at the Pew Research Center, one of the world's leading public opinion polling institutes, and a fact tank that informs the public around the world about issues, attitudes, and trends shaping the world. Over the years, Pew has published several key reports on attitudes towards democracy and key factors that impact people's perception of and support for democracy. We know that social media is a key factor in the declining health of democracy across the world. And one of your latest reports focuses on how social media plays into perceptions of democracy. So, Richard, we would like to hear from you. What does this report find, and what key differences do you see also in perceptions across countries when it comes to social media linkages with democracy? Over to you, Richard.
Thanks so much, Annika, and congratulations on all the great work with the Global Democracy Coalition. Really happy to be here and have a chance to talk about some of the survey work that we do at Pew. As you said, we do a lot of work both in the United States and around the world on attitudes towards democracy, cover a lot of the same topics that my other colleagues on the panel look at in their research. And what I want to focus on today is one specific report we put out late last year that looks at technology and democracy, and specifically how do people see social media having an impact on democracy and politics and society. And I think the results show that people have a pretty nuanced view about the impact of social media. And the findings also, I think, highlight in different ways how what people think about social media reflects concerns they have about the way democracy is functioning in their country. So I'll walk through a few slides that highlight some of the key findings from that report. If you want to move on to the next slide. One of the things that we did in this survey, it was a survey of 19 nations. I'll share the countries with you in just a moment, mostly advanced economies. And one of the things that we did in this survey was we wanted to ask people about potential impacts that social media can have on politics and society in their country. So, here you can see some negative impacts people say that social media is having on their politics. A median of nearly half, 46% say, for example, that social media has led people to be less civil in how they talk about politics in their country. Huge majorities, a median of 84% across these nations, say that social media has made it easier to manipulate people with false information and rumors. About 2/3 say that social media has led people to be more divided in their political opinions. So, less civility, more division, more manipulation. People see these negative effects occurring in their country, and they attribute some of that, at least, to social media. If you go to the next slide, you can see that there are differences, however, across the countries that we included in this survey. If you go back one, this is that question. There you go. This is the question that has to do with the lack of civility in politics, right? Is there more, less as a result of social media, or has social media really not had much of an impact? There are places where people are less negative about this. If you look at Singapore, for example, only 27% say that social media has led to essentially less civility in politics in that country. Americans stand out in the opposite direction, right? They're more likely than any other public we surveyed to say that social media has led to people being less civil. It's nearly 7 in 10 in the United States who hold that view. In lots of questions we included on this survey about social media, Americans are more negative than others. Lots of questions we ask in general these days about politics and how things are going in the country, you see Americans being more negative about the state of politics than many others around the world. You can see more of that if you go to the next slide. On this question we asked, which is sort of an overall assessment of the impact of social media. Do you think that social media has mostly been a good thing or a bad thing for democracy in our country? So again, who's at the top of the list in terms of being most negative? It's the United States. 64% of Americans say that social media has been mostly a bad thing for politics in this country. That's pretty significantly ahead of any of the other countries that we surveyed. Although you do see people are also fairly negative in the Netherlands, in France, Australia, the UK. You've got about half in all those countries also saying that social media has been mostly a bad thing. But the US is the most negative. However, overall, people are mostly positive on this question. You've got a median of 57% saying that social media has actually been, overall, a mostly good thing for democracy in their country, which I think, runs counter to a lot of the narrative we hear about social media and its impact, right? A lot of commentators have attributed many of the ills of our politics and of our society to social media in recent years. Anybody who's spent a lot of time on social media knows it can be a pretty nasty place with lots of division and acrimony. I'm sure we've all experienced that in different ways. And our respondents themselves in this survey, as we just saw, say it can lead to less civility. It can lead to more divisions. It makes people easier to manipulate. So what's to like, right? What are our respondents thinking here? I don't know that our survey completely answers that up, but I think it does, show some ways in which these results sort of, make sense in terms of what people's concerns are about the way their democracies are functioning. In essence, people feel a bit unempowered. They feel powerless, often in their societies, and social media in some ways gives them an opportunity to have some power in politics and in social discussions. We can see a little bit of that here. If you move forward to the next slide, this question highlights the fact that people don't feel like they have enough influence on what's happening politically in their country. How much influence do people like you have on politics in our country? Overall, we get nearly 2/3 saying not much or no influence at all in terms of what happens politically in this country. And, you can see that in several nations, it's more than 7 in 10, here in the United States, several European countries, Australia, Japan, very big majority saying essentially we have little or no influence on what happens politically. And in some ways, social media at least gives people an opportunity to address that and feel like they have some voice. It gives people an opportunity to post their views about politics online, and we know that many people in our survey say they do that. So it's a platform that allows them to engage in politics. And people also think that social media can be effective in the political arena, and you can see that here on this next slide. We asked people about a number of different ways in which social media might have some effect on politics. And by and large, people say it can be effective. So a median of 77% across these nations say that social media can raise public awareness about political or social issues. About 2/3 say it can actually change people's minds about issues. Similar numbers say that it can get elected officials to pay attention to issues, which we know is a criticism that many people have. They don't feel like politicians are paying attention to them. They don't necessarily feel like they're paying attention to the issues that they care about. So social media can be a platform that makes that happen. And then it can actually influence policy decisions, right? So it can, have an impact on political change, which, again, in many of the countries we study, people want changes. Social media can be a platform that makes that more likely to occur. So it's somewhat effective, according to our respondents. If you flip to the next slide, it also informs people, right? We have some other questions on this survey asking people what's important to be a good citizen in your country. And one of the things they say is that it's important to be a good citizen to keep up with and be informed about affairs in our country, as well as issues in other countries around the world. As you can see here, social media is one of the things that does that. Sure, it also provides poor information that allows people to get manipulated, but it also informs citizens about issues both in their own country and around the world. It also makes people, according to a plurality here at least, more accepting of those from different ethnic groups, religions, and races. Now, we also saw a minute ago that it makes people more divided, according to our respondents, right? So those attitudes might be a bit in tension, but it's pretty consistent with what we often see when we ask people about technology, about social media, is that it leads to more of everything. It kind of amplifies the good trends people see in society, and it amplifies the negative trends that people see in society. So yes, it's divisive, but it can also make people more accepting, more tolerant of those who are different from them as well. If you go to the next slide, it highlights the fact that, we saw a moment ago, there are certainly differences across the countries in this study. There are also important differences within countries, along the lines of age, for example, quite often. This is that question about the overall impact of social media on democracy. And what we see is that it's young people who have the most positive evaluations of social media's impact. So you look at Poland, it's 87% of polls between the ages of 18 and 29 who say that social media has been good for their democracy. It's just 46% among those 50 and older. And you can see similarly large age differences in many of the countries that we studied. If you go to the next slide, you'll see the United States is one of those as well. Now, the United States, of course, is a country where overall there's a pretty small percentage relatively of people who say that social media is having a good impact, but it's much higher, nearly half among those between the ages of 18 and 29, and it's only about a quarter or so among those 50 and older. You see a similar pattern along educational lines, among, according to income. It's people who are younger, people who are more educated, people with higher incomes who tend to have the most positive assessments of the impact of social media. Those are the people who use it more, right? So actually, the more people use social media, the more positive they tend to feel about the impact that it's having. And then just one more slide, if you want to move forward to the next one. This survey and this report that I'm talking about today was based on the survey of 19 countries. Most of these were sort of high-income nations. We have seen fairly similar patterns, however, in most of the rest of the world. This is a survey we conducted a few years ago in 11, mostly sort of emerging economies, and we saw, very similar themes. So across these 11 nations, a median of 57% said social media in their country has increased the ability of ordinary citizens to have a meaningful voice in the political process. So again, this notion that it empowers people. At the same time, you also see about 2/3 in these countries saying that it has also increased the risk that people can be manipulated by politicians in our country. So some of those same kind of concerns that we see in the wealthier nations, we also see in these emerging economies. Yes, it can empower, but it can also lead to manipulation and divisions within society. So we see it across the various kinds of nations that we survey in terms of income level. And I'll wrap up. I mean, I think that sort of some of the key takeaways we had from this survey is that people do have a pretty good handle on sort of negative and positive aspects of social media. You know, it does lead to division, lack of civility, manipulation, but it also empowers people at a time when they feel powerless. If you think information is power, certainly our respondents say that it informs people, it exposes them to different ideas and people. It's a platform for them to express their voice, share their views, and it's a public space where you can try to at least to hold politicians accountable, make them aware of issues, and occasionally bring about change. So, you know, there are a lot of reasons to be concerned about social media. I think we're all familiar with. But, you know, in looking at these results, and I'm kind of reminded that it's not going anywhere, right? These platforms in one form or another are going to be around. And if you look at what the ordinary citizens in our surveys say, they haven't sort of given up on social media. They still see ways that it can play a constructive role in politics and, you know, address some of the concerns they have about the way democracy is functioning in their country. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Richard, for these really interesting insights and data points on public attitudes towards social media and democracy. I think we know a lot about this, but you put data and figures to it, and I think that's really the value of the research that you do. Seeing the data both in terms of the democratic potential of social media, I think is really important. Particularly when we saw the differences between the perceptions that social media was actually a positive tool in non-democratic contexts such as Singapore, or hybrid context, or backsliding contexts such as Poland, where social media can provide an important platform for people to express their opinions as long as social media is open. And to place issues on the agenda of decision makers. But also, of course, we all know the polarizing effects of social media, how it divides people within countries and across countries. Interesting but not surprising to see the US as an outlier given the levels of polarization here. So thanks for sharing all this, Richard. Very interesting. And now we're going to turn to one region of the world, Africa. And it's a large and diverse continent, which has seen a gradual democratization over the past decades. But it's also a continent which houses half of the world's hybrid and authoritarian regimes, and where many new democracies have experienced significant challenges in the past years. And Seema referred to the increase in the number of coups in Africa in the last years. I think there's been 9 coup attempts since 2020. So also concerning developments in that region when it comes to democracy. So now we're going to hear from Joseph Asunka. He's the CEO of the Afrobarometer, one of the leading public attitude surveys on democracy in Africa. Joseph, what we would like to hear from you are what some of the key concerns and views expressed by Africans on democracy in the region. Do they echo some of the global findings presented by the previous panelists? What do you see as key differences between global perceptions and those that may be unique to the African context? And finally, what role do you think that the Summit for Democracy can play in addressing some of the concerns expressed by Africans in the survey? So over to you, Joseph.
Right, thanks so much, Annika. And I think the hardest thing to do is to follow Seema and Olaf and Richard after they have spoken so eloquently about issues about democracy from expert opinions, but also, expert views, but also from public opinion. And I think what I'm going to say, it almost matches quite well with what Olaf has presented from Alliance for Democracies, because we pick this information from citizens and they pick it from citizens, which I'm not surprised that there's some correlation between what Olaf just presented and what I'm going to say. And just to take a break from the pattern, I think I'll just speak to you and not present slides. I think sometimes it can get a little tiring, so let me take a break from that. So I'll start by talking about the views. So Annika, you asked about the views and the concerns. I'm going to start with the views, and the views are what I say overlaps neatly with what Olaf says. we have observed over the last 2 decades that Africans' commitment to democracy and democratic norms has remained resilient since 1999 when we started surveying in the continent. And we have seen that these views have not changed much. We've seen some fluctuations over time, but commitment to democracy and democratic norms has stayed almost stable across all the countries that we have surveyed. And if I take, for example, the most recent survey, which is currently ongoing, we expect to complete this round. We call them survey rounds. This round of the survey should be concluded by the end of April. But we do have data from 20 countries for which I can speak to and provide some data points. So from these 20 countries, we have almost close to 7 in 10 Africans saying that they prefer democracy to any other form of government. And I think this is consistent with what Olaf said, the faith in democracy still remains very solid on the continent. And this is a majority view. At the same time, we normally would go further to ask whether people still have nostalgia for some of the autocratic regime that used to be there, say 3 or 4 decades back. We ask about one-man rule, one-party rule, and military rule. And across the board, consistently over time, we have majority of Africans roundly rejecting all the 3 alternate forms of government. So they prefer democracy and they reject one-man rule, they reject one-party rule, and they also reject military rule. Of course, we have talked about military coups in the West Africa region. I'll speak briefly to that later on, but when you hear that majority of Africans in this particular case, almost close to 7 in 10, we have 67% telling us that they reject military rule. And so I'll get to it and then talk a little more about that. But then when it comes to democratic norms and values, large majority still subscribe to democratic institutions and norms. These include things like parliamentary oversight of the president, endorsed by a majority of Africans, 65%. Presidential term limits, endorsed by 73% across the board. And I must indicate here that this is one and the only democratic norm that we see to have majority subscription across all the countries that we've surveyed. We know there's solid support for various democratic norms, but usually when you break it by countries, you have some countries having a minority view on a particular indicator. When it comes to presidential term limits, it is a solid majority across. The minimum support we've seen is 63%, but most countries is in the 70s and upper 80s and 90s. And so this seems to be one of the indicators I feel has a very strong grounding on the continent, a commitment to presidential term limits. There is a lot of commitment to elections as the only legitimate way of choosing leaders, which is also one key democratic norm. And of course, media or press freedom. There's a strong commitment to media and press freedom as well, which is coming in at about 67%. And perhaps maybe more important is our record of people's commitment to accountable governance. So we started asking Africans to whether they would prefer a government that is effective, even if it is not accountable, or they want an accountable government, even if it is not very effective. And over time, what we've seen is the percentage that want accountable governance has actually grown over time. Over the last decade, we've seen a 10 percentage point increase in the proportion of Africans who say they want accountable governance or they prefer accountable governance to that of an effective government that is not accountable. And so we see this as, these are the general views on the continent, and these are generally very positive views on the continent. I think when it comes to the issues of what are their concerns, Annika, you asked about their concerns. I think the key concerns, and Olaf alluded to this, is the supply side. And so usually when we talk about perceptions or views or attitudes towards democracy on the continent or to respondents, we break it down by the demand side, which I just spoken about, and the supply side, what governments are doing to meet the aspirations of citizens. And I think this is where the weakness comes in. And so usually when we ask people about their satisfaction with democracy, are you satisfied the way democracy works, or even do you think that your country is democratic? What we've observed in the ongoing survey round, we have fewer than half, about 45% of Africans telling us that they think their country is democratic. Secondly, we ask about their satisfaction levels. Now, how satisfied are you with the way democracy works in your country? And this also garnered a minority view, only 37% telling us that they are satisfied with the way democracy works. And overall, we normally create an index, which we call the supply side of democracy. And this index for the current round of the survey has actually dropped by 5 percentage points between the last survey round, which was done in 2019, and then the current round, which started in 2021 and going into 2022. And so we do have these results. People's views is that there's solid support for democracy. Unfortunately, the supply side doesn't come as much as they would wish. And often when people talk about the decline of democracy globally, I think we always push to make the case that we should make the distinction between the demand and the supply side. When we talk about democratic decline, sometimes we forget that it is citizens who hold everything about democracy. And the thing is, how are citizens reacting to current trends globally? Is it leading to an erosion of democratic norms or their commitments to democratic norms and democracy as a form of government? On the African continent, we don't see that. We don't see an erosion in people's commitments to democracy and democratic norms. What we see is the weakness on the supply side. Governments not doing what is required of them to deliver and meet the expectations of their citizens. All right, I'll turn briefly to your question, Annika, about how are there any key differences across between the perceptions that you have here and then, of course, that of citizens on the African continent. First of all, as I mentioned, the general discourse that there's democratic decline across the globe, that we always say that let's make that distinction between the demand and the supply side and try to see whether or not whatever may be happening globally, is it leading to people's discontent with democracy? And as Olaf mentioned earlier, and I stated here, we haven't seen that yet. Faith in democracy still remains very strong. The second is on the African continent, and if I don't talk about this, it'll probably, the issue of military coups. People have seen in some countries, whether it's in Guinea or Mali, you have people going into the streets to celebrate the takeover of the military. So these military interventions sometimes do receive some reaction from the general public. And the question is, I think it has provoked some debate. Does that mean that on the African continent, or at least in the countries that these coups have taken place, people are happy that it has happened, and are they celebrating the return of coup d'etats? But I don't think that is the case. Our data does show consistently that Africans reject military rule. We need to make a distinction here too between military intervention and military rule. Because what we have seen is increasingly Africans say, if elected governments abuse their power, they are more willing to countenance an intervention that takes out elected governments that abuse their power. And so when you see people celebrating on the streets, it's more about the relief they get from a system that was spiraling out of control. And there's some intervention to halt that spiral and hopefully put them back on the right track to democratic governance. And so celebrating a military intervention is not the same thing as endorsing military rule. And I have said it over and over again. Africans reject military rule. They may seem to be supporting military intervention, and that is because they want an intervention that will stop the abuse of power by elected governments. On the final point about the Summit of Democracy, so just 2 points
Joseph,
on this one.
Joseph, maybe what we can do is to turn to that question in the Q&A session. I'm so sorry, just to give Pippa enough time for her presentation, and then we can talk about the Summit for Democracy as we wrap up the session. What do you think about that?
Totally fine. That's great with me. All right, so I'll stop here and then I'll turn it over to you, Annika.
Thank you so much, Joseph, for these really valuable perspectives. Echoing some of the global findings that Olaf presented in terms of the strong faith in democracy as a principle, as a form of government by citizens in Africa, but dissatisfaction with the practice of democracy and the delivery of democracy. I think this distinction between the demand and the supply side is really important. And the other point that you made about the support for military intervention, differentiating that from actual support for military rule, and your data certainly shows how what's at stake there and what the dimensions are. So thank you so much, Joseph, for this interesting insights. We will now turn over to Pippa Norris, professor at Harvard University. Pippa is founding director of the Electoral Integrity Project, director of the Global Party Survey, co-director of the Trust Gov Project, co-principal investigator for trust in European democracies, and vice president of the World Values Survey. So we are very, very honored to have Pippa here with us today. Pippa is also former board member of International IDEA, and we're so happy that you are a committed partner and supporter to this work. So Pippa not only provides the perspectives from the World Values Surveys, but it is also intimately familiar with many of the indexes that have been presented today and with the data sources. So we would like to hear from you, Pippa, some broader reflections on what the previous panelists have presented, both in terms of what you see as some of the most pressing challenges to democracy, expressed through both the expert opinion views and the public perceptions. But also it would be interesting to hear some key reflections from you from the World Value Survey, some data points coming out of that, and also some of your most recent research on what you see as some of the main drivers of these trends that we are observing and that we've talked about. So over to you, Pippa.
Thank you so much, Annika, and it's a pleasure to join International IDEA and the Global Democracy Coalition. This is an important summit, and really thinking about the causes and the trends and the data, which is what we've been focusing on, is vital to understand potential solutions. And in particular, obviously, Seema, and going through the work of VDEM, the Variety of Democracy Project, gives us a broad long-term pattern of institutions, and then thinking about how the citizens are responding, as Olaf, Richard, and Joe have emphasized, is also the other part. Perceptions create reality. We need to know how the public sees these trends. So today, what I'd like to do is give a broader reflection and to think about the causes and the drivers of democratic backsliding. And I'm going to focus in particular on the role of authoritarian populism, which I see as the biggest challenge, but think about other explanations as well. So first, I'll think about the broad set of causes. Then I'll talk about why people are so concerned about authoritarian populism, new leaders, new parties who are challenging democracy, the consequences, and I'll give you a snapshot of 3 brief case studies, what's changed in Hungary, India, and Brazil, and then what mitigates these risks, which is the big question confronting us. This is the pattern which Seema has also presented, which is from the VDEM data. And this is patterns of liberal democracy as measured by the Variety of Democracy Project. The vertical axis is the position in 2021 on a 100-point index on things like political rights, civil liberties, and a variety of other measures of institutions. And across the bottom is the 2000 index. So if countries haven't changed, then they're basically on that line, which is the regression line. So a country like Denmark, for example, always was democratic in 2000 and continues in 2021, in 2 decades. And we can see many, many countries haven't changed. What you can also see, as Annika asked about, are the net gains. Countries which from 2000 to 2021 have gained, and we've already mentioned some of these cases, which are there, and they're very diverse. A Peru, a Timor-Leste, a Romania, a Jamaica, all of those are countries which, according to the data, have improved. But the net losses are the concerns, and these are the backsliding cases. And again, we've mentioned some of them, but not all of the most important ones. So when we think about Hungary under Viktor Orban, we think about Poland under the Law and Justice, we think about Modi in India and the challenges which are going on for ethnic tolerance. We think about cases like Benin, which were destabilized after one of the longest standing democracies since 1990. We think about Turkey, of course, with Erdogan, which is even worse affected right now with human disasters. Nicaragua under Daniel Ortega, Venezuela, of course, a long-standing problem under Victor Maduro, one of the longest standing democracies in the 80s and 90s in Latin America, Bangladesh, Russia, of course. And you can see their relative position on these scales, as well as how they've changed. So the question becomes, what's going on? And we can certainly look at experts, and we can look at citizens, and we can look at the relationship between the two. And what I wanted to emphasize from my most recent book, which is In Praise of Skepticism for Oxford University Press, is that there's big differences. So when we ask, to simplify this, we've got the patterns of liberal democracy in the most recent data that's available, again, on the vertical axis. So countries, obviously, which come out well, Sweden, Norway, New Zealand, Denmark, and so on. And other liberal democracies come out less well, including countries like Greece, Czech Republic, Tunisia, of course, which has been destabilized most recently. We can also see that in these countries, trust in government, which is going along the horizontal axis, goes up in liberal democracies with the actual quality of the institutions. In other words, the public is fairly trusting in countries like New Zealand, Canada, where the government and democracy is working well. By contrast, however, look at the countries which I've illustrated in red. And these are the countries which have very little freedom of information, meaning they don't have media pluralism. They have state control of mass communications. They have repression of journalism. They have media that's repressed or censored. And what you can immediately see is that it's not just that there's no relationship between trust in government and the quality of democracy, but in fact, it's the reverse. The countries which are most trusting are countries like China, a one-party state, Vietnam, of course, another, Tajikistan, Myanmar, where the military have taken over from at least the initial transitions to democracy, the Philippines under Duterte, which has had repression, Singapore, a one-party state, Turkey, Iran, Thailand, with a military coup that destabilized the government, Ethiopia with the civil war. So there's a big distinction. And the core summary that you can take away from this slide is that public opinion in countries with freedom of expression, the public does trust the governments which are more democratic. But in countries where there's not freedom of expression, where the public is listening, as it is, for example, in Russia, to the voice of state media, and where criticism of the government is repressed and protests are not allowed, in those cases, public opinion can diverge a lot from the experts. Why? Because public opinion in these countries is not very well informed. I think that's particularly important for all of our pollsters and market researchers on the panel with these wonderful surveys of public opinion. When we measure this in authoritarian regimes, we have to bear in mind that the public may not be either fully informed in their views, or they may not be free to express their views if they're critical of the government or of patterns of democracy. Now, let's go back to the question of backsliding. What's causing it? And here's a range of explanations that you've all heard before. They're very familiar. The bottom line from this slide is that these explanations, whilst widely debated, have not yet been resolved. We don't know the causes of backsliding. We have a lot of information on long-term trends and a lot of information on what causes progression in democracy. We have not yet a consensus about what causes decline. So, for example, political economists say, of course, it's about economic disparities and the rising gap between rich and poor. But we also know that some of the countries which are most equal around the world, think about Sweden, the most egalitarian welfare state and generous, and yet there are tensions about democracy and rights for minorities even in that country. Migration studies say, well, it's about patterns of changes of population, diversity and race in America. But again, we've got countries who are threatened by backsliding, which are fairly homogeneous, as well as countries which are very diverse in their ethnicity. And we also have countries which have been diverse for many, many years, think about in India, which have suddenly seen a change in, for example, levels of tolerance and trust, and in legislation on minority rights. International relations says it's about hegemonic world powers, changes in Russia and China in particular, but also Iran and Saudi Arabia, threatening neighboring liberal democracies. And of course, we think about Ukraine. And of course, we think about the risks to Taiwan, major risks. But again, that doesn't explain more recent changes in the 21st century, and the decline of the breakup of the old Cold War and the reassertion of authoritarian regimes. Why China, for example, which has been largely peaceful towards its neighbors, promoting trade and economic development more than any military threats, should become now much more perceived as a threat to the stability in Southeast Asia. Mass communications, Richard mentioned this, of course, social media. Everybody blames mass communications and misinformation, disinformation. But again, digital technologies are nothing new. The internet was invented with the World Wide Web in 1995. So maybe it's become worse. But of course, we've always had hate radio. Think about Rwanda. We've also had other forms of broadcast media like television and newspapers, which have been around to spread misinformation and propaganda for many years. So again, propaganda, we can think about the Second World War. We don't need to go back even to the 1990s. Leadership studies emphasize particular strongmen. And so you think about a Trump, you think about a Putin, you think about any of the leaders who've been on the world stage, a Bolsonaro in Brazil, for example, AMLO in Mexico. But again, there's nothing new about strongman dictators, many of whom, by the way, who have fallen, like Mubarak in Egypt, have been replaced by other strongman dictators. So it doesn't really provide a general explanation. It just talks about the phenomena, but not what's causing it. Institutions, party polarization, of course, in America, absolutely, new electoral cleavages, majoritarian constitutions in particular, which concentrate power in the executive, that's important. But again, constitutions change slowly. They're not going to change overnight. And so why, for example, the United States has changed the practice of the institutions and democratic norms underpinning them, but a large part of the problems in the United States are to do with constitutional rigidity. The institutions haven't changed. So I come to the cultural backlash thesis. This is the rise of authoritarian populism, which is the explanation I put forward in 2019 with my late lamented colleague Ron Engelhardt. And here we emphasize changes in culture and the ways in which that's led to new leaders and new parties, a mass phenomena, changes in society, changes in the electorate, which in turn have had knock-on effects on how institutions work, on the type of leaders who get elected to power, on the way that mass communication is run, etc. So all of these factors, I'm not dismissing any explanation, but we really need to go beyond the description to think about the causes and the drivers. Now, populist rhetoric is again a widespread discussion. And what we understand by it is a form of rhetoric. In other words, how politicians come to power through their speech, their appeals, how they campaign. And in our book, we say it's basically got two clauses, two aspects, two components. One is that it challenges the legitimate authority of the authorities and the establishment. So the elections are called fraudulent. Most recent case, of course, are challenges to, for example, electoral authorities in Mexico and changes to the independence of the Mexican authorities. Politicians are seen as corrupt. Parties, the opposition parties in particular, are denigrated. And they're not seen as somebody that you bargain with, they're seen as the enemy. Government officials are seen as the state. Intellectuals and experts are denigrated, for example, those on COVID. And the rich and the powerful and multinational corporations and the judges are also denigrated. So the language says you can't trust the authorities. What you can trust, according to populism, are vox populi, the average citizen. Rightful authority is based on popular sovereignty. And the problem with the rhetoric is what Democrat could not agree with that? After all, of course, the public should have their say. Of course, the public should have their voice. The problem is there aren't many mechanisms. So what happens is that populists use this language. In practice, however, they act through authoritarian values, which means the importance of security against the risks of moral instability, whether arising, for example, from groups who are challenging ideas of gender equality, sexuality, minority respect, diversity. And they want to have traditional order versus social disorder. They emphasize conventionalism, the threat of them, outsiders versus us, the rise, for example, of anti-Semitism in Europe in 2021 is remarkable. The rise of misogyny, hate groups against women, incels. And of course, they emphasize loyalty towards the leader who's going to protect the tribe, those traditional social conservatives against others. Now, the rise of authoritarian populism has been widely noted. I won't go into this in depth, You can look at the Blair report if you want to look at some of their indicators. They estimate that the rise in populist leaders has risen rapidly since the end of the Cold War, From the 1990s, this is their estimate of the number of populists in power, emphasizing that the number is not that high overall. Out of over 190 countries, about 20 are being governed by populists as prime ministers or as executives as presidents. But there remain continuous gains, although there are also some losses. Gains in Israel, for example, under the new right-wing coalition in Sweden, for the Sweden Democrats in Italy, the Brotherhoods of Brotherhoods of Italy, Meloni as the prime minister, but also the loss in other countries. For example, Brazil, where Bolsonaro left office due to Lula da Silva's success, the Philippines, where Duterte left, and so on. So the rise is one which has been noted, but the rise of populist parties is even a longer term phenomena. There have always been populist parties, there have always been authoritarians. This is my estimate of the share of their vote, very much marginalized after the Second World War, rising in the 80s and continuing to rise today. We all are very familiar with some of the leaders. This illustrates some of them. Some of them have been around for many, many years. Think about Le Pen and what was the National Front in France. Le Pen most recently coming second, of course, in presidential elections. We know, of course, too familiar about the Trump in the United States, but also Trump acolytes. And I will argue that those like in Florida and in Texas are very much following in his footsteps. Meloni, who's come to power in Italy, but even in countries in the Nordic region. And of course, the role of Viktor Orban being taken up by conservatives in many other countries, but also worldwide. These again are some of the very familiar figures. Again, AMLO having important consequences right now for electoral integrity, Erdogan in Turkey cutting down on human rights, Modi in India with the rhetoric on Hindu nationalism and cutting down on freedom of the press and so on. So, are the two things connected? Does democratic backsliding arise from the rise of authoritarian populists? And the problem here is that even though we see an association, determining causality, meaning what causes what, is not straightforward. For example, it could be that as democracies become weaker and erode, so we find new leaders taking advantage of this, or it could be that as these leaders and parties come to power, not just marginalized, but getting seats in Congress, in parliaments, getting power in ministerial offices and becoming chief executives, we see a decline of democracy. How do we determine this? Well, what we can do is just look briefly at three cases. We'll look at Bolsonaro in Brazil, Orban in Hungary, and Modi in India. What do we see about changes in democracy when these leaders came to power? So each of these is populist. Here's a snapshot about the changes over the last 20 years in patterns of democracy, according to VDEM. And what you can immediately see on the left-hand quadrant is that many of the countries which have got populist authoritarian leaders in power have indeed been the ones with the strongest decline. Viktor Orban, but also Poland, also Nicaragua with Daniel Ortega, also Erdogan in Turkey, India, Brazil. Not every case of decline, I think, has been associated with this phenomena. A military coup d'etat, for example, and military destabilizations has also occurred in some countries. We see economic crisis in others like Greece, but nevertheless, we see that pattern, and the United States, which is highlighted in green, falls into that category as well. Are there populists on the right side of this pattern, countries which have improved, and I'd argue much less clear? But is there a time series trend that would allow us to determine this in these three cases with greater certainty? So this is the Liberal Democracy Index from VDEM in the three case studies over time in the 21st century. And we can see when these leaders came to power. So in Brazil, we can see that there was a decline in liberal democracy, according to these institutions, before Bolsonaro came in. Growing problems of corruption, of imprisonment of opponents, of greater division and protests. But what happens with Bolsonaro is that this exacerbates this trend. So as democracy weakens, Bolsonaro is able to take advantage of that, pressing on party polarization before ultimately being defeated in the election, although, of course, with a mass uprising against Congress, which was a violent uprising, and against the Supreme Court as well. Hungary, an even clearer case. We can see that Hungary was doing relatively well in levels of democracy, according to VDEM, before Viktor Orban came into power as prime minister. Remember, Hungary was joining the European Union, was expanding its economy. Afterwards, as we can see, a dramatic slide. It's a poster child for the decline of liberal democracy, particularly because of the changes he made to the electoral law, and therefore his power through Parliament and through other important changes he has introduced as a result of his executive aggrandizement. And India. Again, India has always had problems of some forms of destabilization, but nevertheless, of course, one of the world's long-standing democracies. And we can see after Modi came to power, a consistent decline in the liberal democracy index, which has continued until the most recent pattern. The latest VDEM is about to come out, and I imagine that it's going to continue to show a decline in these countries, in India and Hungary in particular. And if we look at the consequences, I won't go into violence, but I'll just mention freedom of expression. We have to disaggregate this index to look at broader patterns. And again, what's going on? A slide under all of these leaders. A slide in electoral integrity. One of the most critical factors, as I created the Electoral Integrity Project in 2012, when elections are problematic, when they're seen as fake or fraud, then you have a lack of agreement about how to move forward for opposition parties, how to agree on the consensus for the government. And again, we can see a major slide in electoral integrity in Hungary and in India. More violence at the polls, more challenges to election results, more challenges to the legitimacy of the government. As a result, social conflict and instability in each of these cases, although to a different degree, with different causes and different patterns. It's not one pattern across the world, but nevertheless, we can see this challenge arising. So what mitigates these risks? If, as I've argued, it is associated with authoritarian populism, what can be done? And this, of course, is the challenge for the Summit for Democracy. And the simple answer is there are no easy explanations and no easy solutions, but your solution will depend upon your analysis of the causes. For example, take the Biden administration. The clear emphasis there is on the political economy. And the argument is that it's the lack of policies which are going to really produce economic prosperity in those areas where manufacturing industry has declined. If that's the explanation, then clearly things like the measures which the Biden administration is taking to try and improve manufacturing industry and infrastructure could work. If that's not the explanation, then it won't work. And again, each of these gives you different arguments. For example, if it's mass communication, then of course we need to think about how we create any sorts of checks on misinformation and disinformation, particularly those from abroad, but also those at home. A thorny and complex issue, which I won't go into. If it's cultural backlash, it's extremely difficult to know how we can think about solutions, because culture doesn't change overnight. It doesn't change between one summit to the next summit. It changes on a long-term basis, and it's about the cultural losers as modernization and liberal solutions have expanded and how social conservatives can be accommodated. The last thing I'll mention and then finish, because I know, Annika, we do need a Q&A, is how do we start to measure this better? And this comment is simply with my hat on from the World Values Survey. We're planning Wave 8, and this is a comment as much to my fellow panelists. We've got really good surveys now being done, the Perceptions of Democracy surveys by Lantana, the Afrobarometer with a sterling record on some of these issues, measures which are being made by others around the world, like all of the global barometers. I think what we need to do is less measure attitudes towards democracy or even authoritarianism with a capital A or D. In other words, we need to get rid of those measures in our questions and instead ask about all of the citizens' views about informal norms which buttress democracy and authoritarianism. And so what I'm proposing is that we need questions like the following, which are genuine issues of debate and where there are genuine concerns and different views around the world. For example, as a citizen, do you agree or disagree it's necessary to suspend the constitution in an emergency? Judges should support the government. Minorities should not be able to veto the will of the people, and so on and so forth. These are genuine debates, for example, about the use of violence by the police against protesters, or banning groups who advocate violence, or disobeying the law if it's morally wrong. And I think getting to grips with these informal norms is the next generation of measures we need to take in our surveys. We've already got some measures, very good. We need to expand them and really take this much more broadly. If you want to see any more information, our book on cultural backlash is the one which expands some of these views. And I really welcome and I look forward to the Q&A that we're going to have following this presentation. Thank you very much. I hope that gave you, Annika, an overview which wraps up some of the themes that we've covered in the class. I know it's an enormous amount of questions, but I hope that was a useful presentation.
Thank you so much, Pippa. That was very, very useful, very valuable insights as always from you and from the rest of the panelists. Thanks, Pippa, for bringing in the dimension of trust in government. I think that's an additional complementary perspective. Also recognizing that there is still a lot of work to be done in terms of understanding the drivers of democratic backsliding. You've mentioned several of them. You've also recognized that it's very context specific and that all these different factors that you are referring to come into play in different ways in different contexts. Also, thanks for bringing up the issue of authoritarian populism, both on the left and right of the political spectrum and their implications for democratic backsliding, and also for mentioning that even though they may not always come to government power, the fact that these parties are growing, we know that it has implications for the entire political party landscape in countries pushing parties across the spectrum towards extremes, both on the left and on the right. And thanks also for suggesting some additional questions to future surveys. I think this conversation needs to be continued definitely in another session. So we are running a little bit late, but I would like to take one or two questions from the audience, if there are any, before we go on to the next session. But we are running a little bit late, so I would ask if you can be brief, if there are any questions in the room. David, do you want to start?
Very brief question for Richard. The data regarding the authoritarian countries like Vietnam, we know that the data, they are very highly controlled and manipulated. I just want to ask you about the validity of those data sets.
Yeah, just real quickly, and I'm sure my colleagues have thoughts on this as well. But I mean, I think Pippa mentioned something that's always really important, right? Which is to keep the information environment in mind when you're conducting surveys in countries where information is restricted and the governments are repressed, right, or repressive. So I think you do have to keep that sort of public space in mind when you're asking these kind of questions. What we do at Pew is we often rely very heavily on local partners to guide us in doing research like this in countries where there's a repressive government. They often have a good sense of what can be asked, what can't be asked. They know their respondents better than we do. So that's often where the local partner is really, really important.
Thank you, Richard, and thanks for the good question, David. John.
Thank you. I'm always interested in decentralization and its role in deepening democracy or not deepening democracy. And I'm just wondering if any of these surveys have looked at correlations of the data with strong decentralizers versus highly centralized governments.
Pippa, do you want to give a quick answer to that, if you have one?
So so I did some work on this with the light part idea, which is that power sharing leads to greater consensus and therefore should lead to more stable democracy. And I certainly found that to be the case when you think about some countries which have been highly decentralized, either federal states or with a strong local government, versus those which have been highly centralized. At the same time, our measures of centralization worldwide comparatively are not really very good, even though we have some good positive measures from VDEM. So I think further work needs to be done on that. And you can also think how decentralization and federalism can in fact exacerbate tensions. And we only have to think about the country I'm in right now, the United States, and the way in which different states are moving and diverging on basic policies, whether it's reproductive rights, or whether it's policies of tolerance of homosexuality and trans rights, or other issues which are really cultural war issues. And we see my own state of Massachusetts moving in a more liberal direction on voting rights, for example, and states like Florida and Texas and Georgia and others, Idaho, moving in a much more conservative direction. So overall, yes, the result is more decentralization in general leads to more stable democracies, but not always. Polarization, if it exists, can be exacerbated by decentralization of government.
Thank you so much, Pippa, for this. We're coming to the end of this session. I think there are many more questions. Hopefully we can continue to talk about them in the break. We're going to take a 5 to 10 minute break right now before we move on to the next session. So I want to thank all the panelists for your excellent contributions and very interesting insights. This is a conversation to be continued. This is just the beginning. And thank you everyone for listening in and for coming today.